Just after midnight, a chilling urgency rippled through the silent halls of Buckingham Palace. Princess Anne had invoked a rarely used royal safeguard, an emergency clause buried deep within the monarchy's unwritten constitution. Her demand was clear: an immediate vote to strip Queen Camilla of her title. The reason behind it shook every royal household to its core. For centuries, this mechanism had existed in theory, a fail-safe reserved for moments of absolute crisis. Few believed it would ever be called upon. Yet here was Anne, firm and unflinching, daring to act when no one else would. Known for her relentless commitment to service, Anne's loyalty was never to individuals but to the crown itself. She had always been the one to face storms head-on, not to let them fester in silence. Still, this was a step into uncharted territory. Confusion and dread filled the palace corridors as senior aides were dragged from their beds to prepare briefing documents. Cars were dispatched in haste to summon royals from Windsor and Sandringham, all without explanation. The king's private secretary moved briskly between offices, phone in hand, face set in grim determination. Junior staff whispered nervously, their unease fueled by the absence of answers. Whispers soon pointed in one direction: Camilla. Something she had done, something grave, had crossed an invisible line. Rumors spread like wildfire, a breach of trust, a betrayal Anne could not forgive. No details surfaced, and those closest to the princess kept their silence, intensifying the sense of impending upheaval. The air itself seemed heavier that night. This was no family quarrel or passing disagreement. It was a fight for the monarchy's survival. Anne's summons carried the weight of history. Her action meant to shield the crown from irreparable damage. And yet beneath her iron resolve there was something more, something painfully personal. A wound from long ago had been reopened, one she could no longer ignore. In truth, Anne's decision wasn't only political. It was history demanding justice, and she was the only one willing to answer the call. It was more than political. It was profoundly personal. And it all began with something long buried in silence. Behind the heavy doors of the palace, a discreetly guarded envelope was handed to Anne. What lay inside would unleash a crisis so immense that even the king himself would be powerless to contain it. This was no ordinary letter. Hidden deep within the Windsor archives, it had been shielded from both public scrutiny and the eyes of most within the family. Stamped with the unmistakable seal of Queen Elizabeth II, used only for matters of the utmost sensitivity, the envelope had remained untouched for decades. Few even knew of its existence, and fewer still dared to disturb it. But in the wake of rising unease and whispers of betrayal, it had resurfaced. And now it was in Anne's hands. The moment she broke the wax seal, her world shifted. The letter was unlike any she had ever received from her mother. There was no warmth, no familiar comfort, no personal reflections. Instead, the words were sharp, measured, and unsettling. They warned of the dangers within, of those who, while appearing to serve the monarchy, were in truth serving only themselves. Anne read and reread the letter, each word weighing heavier on her heart. This was not casual advice. It was a warning, urgent, deliberate, and unmistakable. Suddenly, fragments of the past months snapped into focus. Small changes in protocol, private audiences quietly absorbed into Camilla's orbit, and advisors once relegated to the sidelines now exerting disproportionate influence. Even ceremonial duties, once carefully balanced across the family, had been redirected in ways that left Anne uneasy. Piece by piece, Camilla had been drawing the threads together, weaving a web of quiet power. Now, with her mother's words burning in her mind, Anne could no longer dismiss these shifts as coincidence. She recalled one of her last private conversations with the late Queen, an exchange that now took on new meaning. The room had been hushed, the Queen's tone deliberate, her gaze steady and unflinching. "The future," Elizabeth had said, "must remain untainted." At the time, Anne believed it was a reminder to shield William and his children from the turbulence that had haunted the family for years. But now, in light of the letter, she saw the truth. It was a coded charge, a warning to act if ever the integrity of the crown itself was at risk, even if the threat came from within. Holding that letter, Anne knew with chilling certainty that her mother had foreseen this moment. Camilla's quiet maneuvers were not merely unsettling. They were a direct betrayal of the trust Queen Elizabeth had sworn her family to protect. This was no longer about personal animosity or palace politics. It was a violation of the very foundation on which the monarchy stood. Anne could feel her pulse quicken, a fierce clarity taking hold with every breath. The letter was no mere artifact of her mother's wisdom. It was a directive. To honor it meant stepping out of the shadows. She would have to act openly, decisively, and without regret. The path was clear. Whatever fractures it caused within the family, whatever fury it stirred in the public, Anne knew there was no turning back. The threshold had been crossed, and her mother's words had illuminated the way forward. What came next turned quiet suspicion into undeniable proof, setting the stage for a confrontation that could shake the monarchy to its core. To the world, Queen Camilla projected warmth and loyalty, the image of a dutiful consort beside Charles. But within the palace walls, her hand was guiding far more than ceremonial matters. Piece by piece, Camilla was inserting herself into affairs traditionally reserved for the sovereign. Foreign briefings, state planning, even delicate internal communications began to carry her quiet influence. What looked like harmless participation was, in truth, a careful campaign to expand her authority. Anne, with her instinct for spotting threats before they fully surfaced, recognized the pattern. Royal advisers who once reported exclusively to the king now held private meetings with Camilla. These were not idle conversations but calculated strategy sessions, and those attending were often figures resistant to William and Catherine's vision of a modern monarchy. The more Anne observed, the clearer the picture became. Camilla's goal was not to bolster Charles, it was to reshape the monarchy itself in her own image, securing a power base that would outlast any single reign. Her tactics were subtle but effective. Through royal charities, she extended influence into local politics under the guise of benevolence. Invitations to high-profile events were meticulously curated to win over regional leaders who could shift public sentiment. Patronages and grants were steered toward allies, creating a quiet but loyal network tethered to Camilla's prominence. Even inside the household, the balance was shifting. Staff once fiercely devoted to Charles began drifting toward her camp, drawn by the rewards she handed out. Prestigious roles, titles, and honors that elevated their stature. But the most alarming signal came when Anne noticed a redistribution of ceremonial duties. Engagements long entrusted to William, Catherine, or senior royals were subtly reassigned to Camilla's circle. Official explanations spoke of scheduling or representational balance, but the intent was clear. Individually, these changes might have seemed insignificant. Together, they revealed a calculated strategy, an intricate web of control, slowly tightening around the monarchy, strand by strand. The true breaking point came suddenly, and by mistake. A confidential memo, never meant to reach Anne, was accidentally forwarded to a staffer loyal to her. Its contents left no room for doubt. It outlined, in cold and bureaucratic terms, a plan to secure the Queen Consort's role far beyond the current line of succession. This wasn't about supporting Charles. It was about preserving Camilla's power no matter who inherited the crown. Anne read it once, then again. Each sentence steeled her resolve. What had once been whispers and suspicions was now documented fact. A quiet coup was underway, and subtle warnings or discreet conversations would no longer suffice. Camilla's network was too entrenched, her influence too far-reaching. This was not a private quarrel. It was a direct challenge to the future of the monarchy itself. Confrontation was no longer optional. It was inevitable. That confrontation erupted not in a council chamber, but at a family luncheon in Windsor. What was intended as a small, intimate gathering, a carefully staged show of unity, turned instead into open conflict. At first, the meal was civil, but staff watching from the edges noticed the shift almost immediately. The polite small talk thinned, replaced by sharper tones. The tension that had been building for weeks finally snapped. What began as a discussion over schedules escalated into something far more explosive. Anne's voice, steady but edged like steel, cut through the room. She accused Camilla directly of exploiting her position, of undermining the natural succession, of twisting the monarchy toward her own permanence rather than supporting it. There was no ambiguity, no careful phrasing. It was an accusation laid bare for all to hear. The silence that followed was suffocating. Those present later described it as the kind of stillness that grips a room when no one dares move. Camilla did not deny the charge. Instead, she countered, cold, unflinching. She cast herself as the monarchy's indispensable anchor in an uncertain age, suggesting that without her, the crown would falter. Her gaze locked onto Anne's, her words less a defense than a challenge. At the head of the table, King Charles sat paralyzed, torn between the two dominant forces in his life. Witnesses recalled his hands tightening on his silverware, his eyes darting helplessly between his sister and his wife. He searched for words to calm the storm, but none came. This was not his battle to control. Anne pressed again, her voice low but final. "This is not about you, Camilla. This is about the crown, and it will endure without you." The statement landed like a hammer, a line of no return. Then, in a move heavy with symbolism, Anne rose. She left her plate untouched, her chair sliding back in deliberate silence. Walking away from the king's table without dismissal was no small gesture. It was an unmistakable declaration of war. The facade of family unity had shattered. By nightfall, the fallout had engulfed the palace. The Privy Council was drawn into crisis. In his private chambers, Charles faced the most impossible choice of his reign: stand by the woman he loved, or protect the crown entrusted to him by his mother. Camilla was no longer just his wife. She was now the fault line on which the monarchy itself threatened to break. She had been his companion through decades of storms, standing with him under the harshest scrutiny, sharing in his most private burdens. But Anne's accusations could not be brushed aside. They weren't mere suspicions. They were backed by patterns that, if ignored, could alter the monarchy's destiny. Charles knew the dilemma too well. To defend Camilla without reservation could mean betraying the sacred oath he had made to protect the crown. Yet to side with Anne would risk shattering his marriage beyond repair. In hushed meetings with his most trusted aides, Charles admitted the depth of his fear. Not just of scandal, but of the kind of backlash that might cripple the monarchy's already fragile reputation. "One wrong step," he confessed, "and we invite chaos." The institution had endured scandals before, but open conflict between its most senior figures was a danger unlike any other. Alone in the late hours, his mind wandered back to his mother's final counsel, words spoken with a calm that now seemed almost prophetic. Elizabeth had urged him to treat the crown as a trust to be preserved, not only for himself, but for the generations after him. She had warned, with quiet gravity, that personal happiness might one day have to be sacrificed for duty. At the time, he thought it general wisdom. Now he feared she had foreseen this very moment, when his devotion to Camilla would clash directly with his role as sovereign. The presence of William and Catherine only deepened the weight of his decision. Though they remained silent publicly, their steady alignment with Anne's position was unmistakable. They weren't simply taking sides, they were protecting the line of succession that would one day rest on their shoulders. Their stance reminded Charles that this was not only about his reign, but about the monarchy's survival into the future. In desperation, he considered postponing the emergency vote. Perhaps if tempers cooled and the media storm passed, there might be room for reconciliation. But even as he entertained the thought, he knew the risks. Delay could be read as weakness, as an unwillingness to confront the crisis. And perception, in a monarchy, was as powerful as tradition. The lessons of history pressed down on him. He had studied every scandal, abdication, and betrayal. The message was always the same. Hesitation was fatal. The crown could weather controversy, but it could not endure paralysis. Action was required, and soon. But outside the palace walls, time had already run out. The story had broken. By sunrise, headlines blared of rebellion within the royal family. The nation was awake, restless, and dividing itself into factions. Broadcasts across every network dissected Windsor's turmoil, and the monarchy's struggle had spilled into the open court of public opinion. Princess Anne's call for an emergency vote to strip Camilla of her title detonated like a bombshell, one no palace press team could hope to contain. Television networks pivoted instantly, running non-stop coverage with royal experts and political analysts scrambling to explain what could have prompted such a dramatic and unprecedented move. Within hours, newspapers across the country were gone from shelves, their front pages dominated by bold headlines and unflattering images that cast the moment as the most explosive royal crisis in decades. Public opinion split sharply. Early polling revealed a deep divide. Supporters praised Camilla's years of loyalty and steadying presence beside Charles, while traditionalists rallied to Anne's side, insisting the monarchy's honor and the late Queen's legacy must not be compromised, even for the King's wife. The mood shifted by the hour as fresh leaks and speculation surfaced. Social media turned into a war zone. One set of hashtags demanded Camilla's immediate removal, while others accused Anne of overreach. Influencers, pundits, and politicians all seized on the chaos, tailoring their takes to their audiences. Old clips of Anne and Camilla at public events resurfaced, dissected in slow motion by amateur sleuths who claimed to see years of veiled resentment in their body language. By the end of the day, the private dispute had spiraled into a national fixation. Outside Buckingham Palace, the clash spilled into the streets. Protesters gathered in swelling crowds, some hoisting signs that read, "Protect the Crown," others declaring, "Stand with Camilla." Voices rose against one another in dueling chants, the palace gates becoming a fault line for public anger. Police moved in to contain the unrest, wary of how quickly the atmosphere was turning volatile, even as bewildered tourists were swept up in the spectacle. Meanwhile, former palace insiders flocked to television studios, eager to feed the frenzy. Some claimed Anne and Camilla's animosity had simmered for years, visible in subtle slights and cold silences at family gatherings. Others argued their relationship had once been cordial, and that only recent events had poisoned it, making the rupture even more shocking. Regardless of the truth, every anecdote was treated as a clue, each one fueling the narrative further. And the drama was no longer confined to Britain. Across the Commonwealth, leaders and citizens voiced unease, questioning what the turmoil meant for the monarchy's stability. International papers portrayed it not just as a feud between two powerful women, but as a battle over the future of the crown itself. In nations where Republican movements had been gaining quiet momentum, the crisis was held up as proof that the institution was fractured beyond repair. The crisis had broken its walls. It was no longer just a palace scandal, it was a global spectacle. As headlines blared and commentators across continents dissected every move, the monarchy could no longer treat this as an internal dispute. The battle lines had been drawn, the stakes had never been higher, and the outcome could not be foretold. While the world argued, the royal family braced for judgment. In one of Britain's most closely guarded rooms, The gilded chamber where centuries of history had been shaped, the fate of Queen Camilla's title now rested on a single vote. The atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with protocol and tension. Even the most seasoned royals felt the weight of it, their posture stiff, their silence thick. The emergency council had been invoked under an ancient clause rarely used, demanding absolute secrecy and granting authority only to a select few with the power to steer the monarchy's course. The grandeur of the setting masked the gravity of what was unfolding. This was no pageant. It was a reckoning. The rules left no room for ambiguity. Every council member would hear the arguments, withdraw to deliberate, and cast a final, irreversible vote. No abstentions, no postponements. Whatever was decided here would echo far beyond the palace gates. Anne rose first. Her words were sharp and deliberate, forged not for drama, but for consequence. She spoke of the irreparable harm the monarchy would suffer if personal ambition were allowed to overshadow duty. She invoked her mother's legacy, the late Queen's steadfast defense of the institution's dignity, and warned that to ignore this danger was to betray that sacred trust. Her tone never faltered, but the conviction in her voice carried unmistakable weight. This was not just an argument. It was a warning, rooted in her bloodline and her duty. When Camilla stood, her answer was calm, yet laced with defiance. She cast herself as the victim of envy and palace intrigue, unfairly maligned for the role she had worked tirelessly to fulfill. Anne's accusations, she argued, were nothing more than personal grievances dressed up as concern for the crown. She reminded the council of her sacrifices, her years of loyalty, and her belief that she had always acted for the monarchy's survival. Her eyes swept the room, unyielding, daring anyone present to doubt her. The chamber held its breath. Each word spoken carried the weight of history, and the monarchy's future balanced on the edge of a single decision. Every pause seemed to stretch into eternity, heavy enough to splinter under its own strain. Eyes flickered across the chamber, but few dared break the silence. This was not a matter for negotiation. It was absolute, an all-or-nothing reckoning. When the time came to cast votes, it happened in near total quiet. Each declaration landed with the weight of a hammer blow, final and irrevocable. The tally was painstaking, every scratch of the clerk's pen slicing through the silence. With each mark, the chamber edged closer to a verdict that would shape the monarchy for decades. And then, at last, the result was spoken aloud. But the reaction was nothing like anyone had imagined. The decision struck like thunder. The monarchy itself seemed to quake beneath it. There were no cheers, no sighs of relief, only stunned gasps, the muffled sound of someone fighting back tears, and the stoic stillness of those unwilling to betray their shock. All eyes turned to Camilla. She sat rigid, her face unreadable, holding herself together by sheer force of will. Then, without a word, she rose. Her exit was steady, deliberate, almost regal in its restraint. She didn't glance at the cameras waiting outside, nor acknowledge the barrage of questions that followed. She simply vanished into the palace's inner corridors, leaving behind a silence far louder than any statement. Anne remained seated, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. There was no smile, no outward display of victory, only a quiet sense of duty fulfilled, tempered by the knowledge that this triumph had torn the family apart. She had acted for the survival of the crown, but in doing so, she had carved a chasm that might never be bridged. Finally, the king's voice broke the silence. His words were formal, measured, the tone of a sovereign acknowledging the council's will. Yet beneath the composure lay unmistakable grief. It was the grief of a man who had just witnessed the woman he loved stripped of her place, and who knew that to defy the decision would mean betraying the very oath he had sworn. His statement was brief, balanced on the knife's edge between dignity and heartbreak, an attempt to steady the monarchy even as it bled. In the hours that followed the vote, It was William and Catherine who stepped forward to steady the monarchy's fragile image. Their appearance was staged with care, yet beneath the choreography there was a genuine resolve. They spoke of unity, of service, of the future they hoped to build together. To the watching public, they became the embodiment of stability, two figures projecting continuity at a time when the monarchy seemed most uncertain. But those closest to them knew the truth. Behind the polished statements and graceful smiles, they were holding together an institution shaken to its foundations. The question loomed unspoken. Could the monarchy endure such a wound? The unity it had always projected outward now looked more like a delicate illusion, one that could splinter at the smallest crack. Former allies had turned into rivals. Trust had become scarce, a commodity too costly to spend lightly. And as the palace grew quiet and its lights dimmed, a final revelation surfaced, one that would alter everything. Whispers began to spread of a sealed document, locked away in the Queen's private archives. For days, palace staff dismissed it as rumor, but then a senior archivist, long regarded for his discretion, confirmed its existence. It was a file prepared by the late Queen herself, marked for release only in the event of a constitutional challenge regarding the role of the Queen consort. Few had ever believed such a safeguard would be necessary, until now. When the document was finally read aloud to those permitted to hear it, the effect was immediate and devastating. In clear, unequivocal language, Elizabeth II had set a condition. Camilla's title was to remain provisional, dependent entirely on conduct that upheld the dignity of the crown. This was no suggestion. It was not a gentle note of guidance. It was a directive, firm, binding, and absolute. With those words, Anne's controversial action was transformed. What hours earlier had seemed like defiance or vendetta was now seen as duty fulfilled. Her critics, who had accused her of jealousy or overreach, suddenly found themselves silenced. Even skeptics who had questioned her timing now understood. Anne had not acted out of impulse. She had carried out her mother's explicit will, honoring the monarch they had all sworn to serve. The letter, hidden away until that moment, had become her strongest ally, Elizabeth's voice echoing from beyond the grave with the authority only she could command. For Camilla, the fallout was shattering. Though she remained at the king's side as his wife and a royal in name, she was no longer queen consort. The title had been stripped away, leaving her presence forever marked by the weight of that demotion. Every future appearance, whether at state occasions, private audiences, or charitable engagements, would be framed by what she had lost. She was bound to Charles by marriage, yet separated from the authority and stature she once wielded. The monarchy itself emerged from the ordeal both scarred and, in some ways, fortified. To traditionalists, the enforcement of the late Queen's directive was a powerful reminder that the crown stands above any single person. Even the highest titles, they argued, were not beyond accountability. But to the public, the spectacle left wounds. The carefully maintained image of royal unity had been pierced, replaced by a raw awareness of deep internal divides. The mystique was gone, and in its place stood a family revealed as fractured and fallible. Still, the sense lingered that this was not the end, but the start of a new chapter. From this point forward, every move by the senior royals would be judged against the standard set by that sealed document. Elizabeth II's words had not only determined Camilla's fate, they had set a precedent that could one day be invoked again. And so, in a single night, the monarchy was reshaped. Not by coronation, not by tragedy, but by the resolve of a princess who refused to remain silent.